Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Dr. Robert Epstein, a distinguished scientist, former Psychology Today editor-in-chief, founder of the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies, and senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. We'll be discussing Google, which he says is the biggest company and monopoly in the history of the world, and how what Google is doing and other big tech companies poses a great threat to the freedom, liberty, privacy, and democracy of not just us in America, but the entire world. Now, Dr. Epstein, for centuries and for millennia, mankind has often been ruled overtly by an iron fist, if you will, through sometimes respectable monarchies, despots, and dictators. But it seems, thanks to the technology developed after 4 industrial revolutions, we're moving into some kind of Machiavellian covert digital dictatorship, a friendly fascism, a totalitarian democracy. I believe you've likened the function of Google to a totalitarian regime. You've produced a lot of research, given many interviews, testified before Congress last summer on Google, and how Google has been interfering in elections in an undetectable or ephemeral fashion by swinging tens of millions of votes, not just in the US, but around the world. So could you tell us a little bit about your work on the search engine manipulation effect, or SEAM, and give us your latest thoughts on what's happening with this and what this means for our future?
For more than 7 years now, I've been conducting controlled experiments on a number of new forms of influence that the internet has made possible. So the first one was the one you mentioned, which I call SEAM, which stands for Search Engine Manipulation Effect. I discovered that in early 2013. Basically performed some experiments, which I thought were defective in some way because I couldn't believe the numbers I was getting. But I performed some experiments which showed that when search results, the kind you get when you perform a search on Google, when search results favor one candidate, first of all, people can't even see that. I mean, how would you see that if you think about it? Because what that means is if you click on a high search result, you end up going to a web page that makes one candidate look really good and maybe the other candidate look bad. So how would you know in advance just by looking at the search results? It's impossible. So people can't see that favoritism. That's number one. Number two, that when there is favoritism in search results, that very rapidly shifts the opinions and the voting preferences of people who are undecided. So that's the key here. There are people who are vulnerable, who can be influenced. And it turns out that the search results is an extremely powerful form of influence. And when you think about it, search results always put one dog food ahead of the other, or one comparative shopping service ahead of the other. That's a very controversial issue in Europe. And also one candidate ahead of the other. In other words, the search engine has no equal time rule built into it. It's always going to favor one candidate. So here's the problem. When you favor one candidate, that can easily shift anywhere between 20 and 80% of undecided voters, even after one search. Now, if people are searching over and over again for a period of weeks or months on election-related topics, that means over time in a big country where there are a lot of votes, a lot of voters, it means you can literally shift millions of votes over time. And because there's no record kept of search results that are generated just for you on the fly in the moment, because there's no record of them, in other words, they're ephemeral, it means no one can figure this out. In other words, no one can go back in time and figure out that either accidentally or on purpose, your search engine determined who won the election. And so as of 2015, I calculated that upwards of 25% of the national elections in the world were being decided by Google's search algorithm. This is independent of whether executives or employees at the company are doing anything deliberately. The algorithm alone is literally deciding close elections around the world. So that was where it started. That was SEAM. That was back in 2013. I'm still doing research on SEAM, trying to understand it better and better. But since then, I've discovered about a dozen other new forms of influence that are very much like SEAM. The one that we're focusing on right now is called YME, which stands for YouTube Manipulation Effect. I should have some numbers that I trust by April or May, but it looks like YME is going to be even more powerful than SEAM. And here's the thing. The people at Google know that they have this power. We know this from leaks, from documents, a couple of videos that have leaked, and we know this from whistleblowers who have either been fired by Google or who've just voluntarily quit Google. We know this without any doubt. In other words, I am year by year by year stumbling onto, discovering, studying, quantifying a phenomena which people at Google have always known about, or have known about for a long time. I'm a latecomer, if you think about it. The fact that I'm finding these phenomena, I'm coming in rather late. So this is it's really quite frightening. I have to tell you, it's really quite frightening, because the more I have learned about the power that Google has to shift opinions and votes and attitudes and beliefs and purchases without people knowing and without leaving a paper trail, the more I've learned about this, the more concerned I have become. And over time, I've also become concerned about my personal safety because, of course, there aren't too many people out there who are researching these things and who are, going public with this information. I mean, you have to be nuts to fight Google. You have to be crazy, because they have so much power, and they exercise that power.
I refer listeners to some previous interviews that you've given, such as a recent one with Mercola that was 2 hours long, and you go into a lot of detail there. So I don't want to spend so much time on that. But another one of my questions: how important is it to examine the nexus between big tech and what Eisenhower in his farewell speech called the military-industrial congressional complex, and he warned of the scientific elite that would come about if we weren't paying attention. Because, apart from the CIA and NSA seed funding Facebook and Google back in the day, sometimes it seems that big tech today effectively operates as an arm of the Pentagon, because you see them terminating social media accounts of foreign leaders, Iranian, Venezuelan, American activists that discuss a narrative that's contrary to U.S. foreign policy or other aspects. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm so glad that you brought up President Eisenhower. I was just writing about him yesterday. People who remember him or who study about him mainly remember him as a great general. He was actually the head of Allied forces that fought the Nazis in World War II. So he was a great general. Then he became president, and in fact we don't think about him very much as president, except for his departing speech. The speech he gave in January of 1961, just a few days before John F. Kennedy became president, is an extraordinary speech. And yes, it uses that phrase, military-industrial complex, which you just said. But guess what? There's more in that speech, because Eisenhower also warned about the rise of a technological elite. This was 1961. He warned about the rise of a technological elite that could take control over public policy without people knowing, and basically rule our country without people's awareness. He actually warned about this in 1961. He said that we have to be extremely vigilant to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Now, unfortunately, my work and some other research out there as well, and of course the whistleblowers, uh, suggests that the technological elite now exists. Now, let me give you a quote here, since it's right in front of me. Let me give you a quote from a book, very famous book in the US called The Hidden Persuaders, which came out in 1957. It was written by a journalist. And this was about new forms of control that companies were using and some politicians were using that were invisible to people. That's what this whole book is about. The Hidden Persuaders. It is still in print, believe it or not. It's been in print since 1957. It's been updated. How many books, besides the Bible, can you say that about? And in this book, Vance Packard, the author, quotes a British economist named Kenneth Boulding, who at that time was a professor in the US, as saying the following, and I'm just going to read it. A world of unseen dictatorship is conceivable, still using the forms of democratic government. I'm going to say it again because it's so extraordinary. A world of unseen dictatorship is conceivable, still using the forms of democratic government. That's from 1957. Unfortunately, I believe we are now in that world.
And yeah, I mean, that's really heavy stuff. And I mean, you've talked about some solutions. So previously, and what you testified about was one solution for that was to make kind of like a public comments, Google's search index, and to create more competition. But I mean, how optimistic are you of that happening? But even if that happened, would that solve this problem and what you just described?
Well, it would reduce Google's ability to have impact anywhere in the world. In other words, if their index, the database they use to generate search results, if that was turned into a public commons, and there's precedent for that, by the way, both in law, in Europe and the United States, and in Google's own business practices, there's actually precedent for that. If that happened, in other words, if you and I and my kids could all set up competing search platforms by drawing on Google's database, within a few months, within a year or two, there'd be thousands of competing search platforms. Search would become competitive again, as it was in the beginning. I mean, Google was not the first search engine. It was the 21st search engine. And search used to be highly competitive. Search would become competitive again, and there'd be a lot of innovation introduced in search. There's been no innovation in search for 20 years because of Google. No innovation at all. It looks the same as it did back then, and everyone in the world uses it, and that's it. We're stuck. We've been stuck. So, could this be implemented? Could some authority turn Google's index into a public commons? Most certainly, yes. The European Union could do it, for example. The European Union has been very aggressive in challenging Google and to a lesser extent Facebook. The European Union could do it because 5 of Google's data centers, they only have, I think, 12 or 13, are in Europe. So most definitely the EU could do it. And there are several agencies, federal agencies in the US that could do it. Our Congress could do it. It actually could happen. In some respects, it would even be good for Google because, if big users like Microsoft, which has a terrible search engine called Bing, but if big users like Microsoft started drawing on Google's index, they'd have to pay Google. So Google could still make money, but the point is there would be thousands of search engines. You would turn search into an environment that looks like our media environment, where there are thousands of media sources. They're all vying for your attention. They all specialize on different issues. They focus on different demographics, different types of people. You'd have search engines that focus on women. You'd have search engines that focus on the Netherlands and on conservatives and so on, which is good. That's how our media system works around the world. That would be good for everyone. So, will this happen? I can't say for sure. There is a problem here. There is a problem. We have a problem, Houston, as it says in the movie. The problem is that I'll pose it as a question. What happens if the new mind control machine doesn't want you thinking bad things about the new mind control machine? So the problem is that Google has such power to influence opinions and to influence politicians and to buy politicians and to get certain politicians elected. Again, it's hard to fight them. Hard to fight them. So, I can't be certain that my idea will be implemented, but I know it would be good for humanity. Might even be good for Google, and it would take care of at least the threat that Google poses to democracy and to human autonomy. Now, we still have other companies out there that have almost as much power as Google does to influence opinion. So, but I can only go one step at a time. So I think Google is the worst offender. Google is the biggest threat. There is a very simple way to remove the threat that Google poses, and that is to turn its search index into a public commons.
I wanted to go back to the worst case scenario. So you provided a solution there, but we're seeing this increasing censorship all around the world, and especially now creeping in the West. Dissident thinkers on the left and the right are having their accounts terminated, but it's now shocking to see how this is creeping into the real world, because I've been reading about just a few people at the moment, but this can get worse, where they're having their Airbnb accounts terminated, Uber, PayPal, and even some cases, bank accounts. They're discussing now for political Visa and MasterCard. We're discussing for political views, canceling your bank accounts. I've recently had trouble with one bank account at the moment I'm fighting with, and so I'm wondering what's going on. And there are countless dystopian novels that depict this technocratic dystopian future, as well as you mentioned the Bible. I think there's some prophecies there about a dystopian kind of global state. So if big tech isn't broken up, or if Google doesn't provide its search index, will we end up living in this global Black Mirror scenario, or this Chinese Sesame social credit system?
Unfortunately, that's a distinct possibility. And in my opinion, the year 2020, which is happening now, is possibly a turning point. It's going to take us in one direction or the other. Because I've calculated that the big tech companies, which are mostly American companies, they can shift in our presidential election this year. They can shift 15 million votes without anyone knowing that they've done so, and without leaving a paper trail for authorities to trace. So if I can figure that out, guess what? They could figure it out even more precisely. So this means that this year, in the U.S. and possibly other countries too, but certainly in the U.S., we're going to go one way or the other. In other words, there's either going to be a sweep of candidates around the country, including in Washington, D.C., that are put in office by big tech companies, the main, most powerful one being Google, or not. And if they're allowed to shift all of those votes completely unchecked, then I think we are headed, unfortunately, in that dystopian direction, because what will happen is they will simply consolidate the power they have, and that power will grow. In Obama's second term of office, 6 federal agencies in the U.S. were run by former Google executives. His chief technology officer was a former Google executive. Hillary Clinton's chief technology officer, Stephanie Hannon, former Google executive. There were about 240 people who swapped between high positions in Obama's administration and high positions at Google. And there were about 450 visits to the White House by Google representatives. That's about 10 times more than any other company. Now, all of that disappeared when Trump came into office. I am not a Trump supporter. I'm not a conservative. I'm not a Republican. And I'm not anxious to see Trump serving another term. But under Trump, okay, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, 51 attorneys general around the country, Congress, they're all investigating Google, all of them. This is happening under his administration. To contrast that with Obama in January of 2014, when 2013, January 2013, when Obama began his second term, one of the first things he did, literally within days, was to shut down the antitrust investigation against Google that had been started by our Federal Trade Commission. One of the first things he did was shut down the investigation, even though the report that had been issued the month before from the FTC had found clear evidence that there was significant bias in Google search results favoring Google products and services. In other words, the staff at the FTC was recommending that they go forward, that the investigation had to be continued and expanded, and Obama just shut it down. And he shut it down right after a representative from Google visited the White House.
Yeah, that's some interesting information. And I wanted to go look a bit on the individual, what individuals can do, because you've been talking about what we can do as a society. But look at some new developments. You've written an article that people can find online that's very useful, 7 simple steps toward online privacy, many of which I have already implemented. And this can help people protect themselves in this Orwellian environment. But I wanted to go a little further than the article because there have been some kind of new developments. So one of the first things you suggest is getting off Gmail and the Google Suite. So I'll just give some of my examples of what I've been doing. So I was a early believer in StartMail and StartPage because of Catherine Albrecht, who I've interviewed on this podcast. And so I was subscribing, paying for StartMail, and then apparently recently they were bought, or a significant percentage of StartPage was purchased by an advertising company. So enemies of privacy. And then so now moving on to like the smartphones, right? Getting off of Android and Apple. So I bought the Silent Circle black phone. I spent $1,000, one for my wife and for myself, and that turned out to be a dud. They stopped supporting the first edition. And you were talking about BlackBerry in Mercola's interview, but recent news, the Chinese company that was supporting BlackBerry apparently pulled out, and now BlackBerry doesn't seem to have a future. So now on the smartphone front, it's not looking good. And then going to the VPNs now, one more example. I bought my first VPN was the Private Internet Access, PIA. Recently, they were bought by a company that has ties to Israeli intelligence. And so it's just like, it seems that, the article that you wrote and, this hope that we had some privacy alternatives, I don't know what's going on. I mean, can you comment on this?
It's a battle. You can think of it as a kind of cat and mouse competition. It's definitely a battle. I need to update that article to talk about what's happened with StartPage. The reason I haven't done that yet is because I wanted to be clear about what I was recommending as an alternative. What I've done is I've set up a URL, which is privatesearch.com, private spelled P-R-Y instead of P-R-I, so as in we don't pry. So I've set up privatesearch.com, and privatesearch.com will automatically take you to whichever search engine I think right now is the best and the most private. So at the moment, if you go to privatesearch.com, that's private P-R-Y, it takes you to a European search engine, which is called Swiss Cows. Terrible name for a search engine, but it's quite good, and it does preserve your privacy. It's a shame about StartPage. It really is a shame. And it's a shame about what's, this recent announcement about BlackBerry. That's very new. It's very troubling. It's a war. I called it a game, but I think it's a war, and it's going to be hard for those of us who want to preserve privacy, at least the option for privacy. It's getting harder and harder for us to do this. Now, it has to almost be a part-time job, you know. And I mean, I do it well. I have not received a targeted ad since 2014. The website that people can go to get that article, or the URL, is my 7simplesteps.com. That'll take you to the article. And I agree, though, it needs to be updated. My 7simplesteps.com. So there are things you can do as individuals, but it's true. I agree with you that, you know, you might take all the precautions possible right now, and then next week they're not adequate anymore. You know, those precautions don't protect you quite so well. That's the world we live in. We are under siege by technology companies who pose three enormous threats to humankind. Which is, number one is, of course, massive surveillance. And that's the privacy problem. And number two is censorship, which you mentioned. That's extremely dangerous, because when you censor, when you suppress information, people don't know because they don't know what they don't know. That's the problem with censorship. It's an extremely powerful way to control people. And the third area is just manipulation in general, because there's so many techniques now that can be used to manipulate people without their knowledge. We're studying YouTube now because it turns out that 70% of the videos around the world that people watch on YouTube are suggested by Google's top secret up next algorithm. 70%. So you go on YouTube and you watch the video you want to watch, there's a 70% chance that the next video you're going to watch is suggested by their algorithm. So I've come up with a way to actually study this and quantify the impact that algorithm is likely having on people's, again, attitudes, beliefs, opinions, purchases, votes. And I have a feeling that the numbers are just going to be staggering. But as I say, I've talked very briefly about two different manipulation techniques. I've discovered more than a dozen at this point. I mean, I could spend the rest of my life just investigating those, and I'm sure there are many more, because, again, I'm not Google, right? I don't know what's happening there internally. I do know that one of the email exchanges that was leaked to the Wall Street Journal in 2018, I do know that in that email exchange, one Google employee says to a group of them, says, "How can we use ephemeral experiences? How can we use ephemeral experiences to change people's views about Trump's travel ban?" I couldn't believe I was seeing that. I couldn't believe it. Could not believe it, because, again, that's what I've been studying. I've been studying these very fleeting experiences that we all have every day as we look at news feeds, for example, or as Google flashes search suggestions in front of us as we're typing a search term. These are fleeting. These are ephemeral experiences, which I study, and I study their impact, and their impact is enormous. It's incredible. And here's a Google employee actually saying in writing, how can we use ephemeral experiences to change people's opinions? Wow. So, this is what we're up against here. Let me mention too that on the censorship issue, because I know you're concerned about that one. On the censorship issue, in 2016, I published a very long investigative article in a magazine called U.S. News and World Report that I called The New Censorship. And it was about 9 of Google's blacklists. I had never seen a Google blacklist. No one ever had seen one, but I wrote about 9 of them in detail, explaining exactly how the company uses them. I know this as a programmer, that they had to exist. And it was just last year that Zachary Voorhees, who might be a good person for you to interview, Zachary Voorhees left Google after being there for 8.5 years as a senior software engineer. He left Google voluntarily and took with him 950 pages of documents and a video. And among those documents were 2 of Google's blacklists. and they were actually called blacklists. So, I'm not imagining these things. I've been writing about and studying these issues for a long, long time now. And for a while I was kind of a lone voice, but I was positive that what I was finding was absolutely correct. And more, the kinds of assertions I've made over the years, they have been confirmed. Every single assertion I have made has been confirmed, either by documents, videos, or whistleblowers.
So that's frightening. If you could just quickly answer this question, because I have friends, I talk to people about this, and they say I have nothing to hide, and they got their Fitbits and they're using the Google. And how do you answer that?
Well, first of all, you should throw your Fitbit in the garbage, because that's now given. Google bought Fitbit recently. That's now given them all kinds of physiological information, streaming in real time up to Google servers, physiological information in real time about millions of people. If you have a Fitbit, throw it away. There are competitors out there. You do not want to be giving more data to Google, especially about your body. But the point is that people who think they have nothing to hide, and so they're not concerned about all the surveillance, I think I need to write an article just on this issue, because that is so naive. Okay, we all have things that we want to hide, first of all, but even if you live the life of a saint, I don't know anyone who does. Even if you live the life of a saint, you don't know how the data are being used. That's the problem. So more and more we have learned about Google, and especially Facebook, that the data they're collecting is being used in ways we couldn't possibly have imagined. Sometimes it's being shared, for example, with other companies. Sometimes it's being shared with intelligence agencies. It's being used to create digital models of us, which are used to predict our behavior, our thinking, our purchases, literally predict everything we do, think, and say 24 hours a day. We don't know how these data are being used or how they're going to be used. And again, the more information you give about yourself, the more, especially highly personal information you give, the easier it is for a company or some other entity, a government agency, or let's say someone with bad intentions, to control you. Because if you can predict, you can control. So, and then what about our children? See, no one even talks about that issue, and I'm not even allowed to study that. I wish I could, but I would never get permission. You have to get permission to do research. I would never get permission to do that. But I'm sure that all of the techniques that I've been studying with adults are also operating on children, and the surveillance, the manipulation that's affecting our children. I have 5 children. I mean, I find this terrifying, because our children are more immersed in the world of technology, than adults have ever been. At one point I was checking on my daughter, because parents do that when kids are sleeping sometimes. And I went into her room, and there were 5 electronic devices around her pillow. Talk about being immersed in technology. So all of these issues that I've expressed concern about, they're a problem for us as adults, but I think they're a bigger problem for our children and the world in which our children are going to grow. And I think this is a pivotal year. I think if we don't take very concrete steps this year to get these companies to back off or to take away their powers, it's possible we'll never be able to stop them, and they will, in some sense or other, take over.
Well, that'll do it for this episode. And I know you're one of the few, or perhaps only person doing this research at this level in the world. And I know you have these bigger projects, and I think you need funding. If I recall, it was something like $50 million. And so, how can people best support you? I mean, even I'm sure you can take small donations. I think on your website, there's a button there. Where can people go to support you?
Very simple. Just go to mygoogleresearch.com, and you can learn more about my research, but you can also support the research. And yes, small gifts are very helpful. We have people now, a lot of people making monthly gifts that just are programmed in automatically. And now and then we've gotten some very large gifts just by people going to that link. So again, it's mygoogleresearch.com. But yeah, we need a lot of money to do large-scale monitoring in advance of the 2020 election. And so I've been kind of out of it the past few months. I've had some health issues, and unfortunately, my beautiful wife was killed in a car accident a few weeks ago. And so I've been kind of out of it, but I'm trying to get back on my feet now, because it's to me it's urgent that we set up systems to monitor what the big tech companies are showing people that could have an impact on votes in the 2020 election in the US. Because, again, I've calculated that tech companies, if they all support the same presidential candidate, which is very likely, they will be able to shift 15 million votes. In other words, the tech companies will, without us knowing, they will pick the winner. And the only way to stop them, there's no time for laws or regulations, and those the company would just fight in court anyway. The only way to stop them is by setting up large-scale versions of the monitoring systems that I set up in 2018 and 2016. If we can detect and expose day by day bias, favoritism on YouTube, on Facebook, on news feeds and search results, and so on and so forth. If we can detect that and collect massive amounts of data and expose that day by day, expose it to the media, expose it to the Federal Election Commission, expose it to Congress, I think these companies will back off, and we'll detect that. We'll know when they have backed off. And that will, again, give us, the so-called free and fair election, which is still, of course, full of dirty tricks, but at least they're competitive dirty tricks. It's two sides, each using dirty tricks against each other. But when the tech companies, unfortunately, become part of that system, you cannot counteract what they do. That's the problem. See, if you set up a billboard or you buy a TV commercial, I can set up a billboard and I can buy a TV commercial. But if Google wants to favor me for president, I don't think they would do that. But if Google wants me to be the next president, and they basically use all the techniques they have available to them, you cannot counteract that. That's a non-competitive practice. It's invisible, leaves no paper trail, can't counteract it. Think about that. That's what's happening right now.
You've got your work cut out for you. Well, we wish you the best, and not only for the work, but I think you're also an inspiration, because you keep going in light of all the difficulties that are happening, and you inspire the tiny little podcasters like us to not throw in the towel and to keep going. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for just paying attention. It's nice to know some people are interested in what I'm doing. So I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.